war in Croatia, which began in the second half of 1991, is a result of the Serbian policy aimed at creating ethnically clean areas and at expanding its territory by eradicating the thousand-year-old Croatian culture. Thousands of people were forced to seek shelter in damp cellars and finally to abandon their homes and property, carrying with them only painful memories of their relatives, their friends, and their heritage. The town of Vukovar developed on the western bank of the Danube alongside the river Vuka on the hillsides of Fruška Gora. Vukovar has been inhabited since the Neolithic Age. It had many archaeological sites dating from prehistoric times to the Middle Ages, and well-preserved period buildings and parks. Vukovar was one of the most treasured old cities in Croatia. In the 18th century, Vukovar became a center of the county of Srijem. Buildings were preserved with porches typical of the period, or with an array of styles ranging from classical and historic to Art Nouveau. One of the outstanding examples of feudal aristocratic architecture in Croatia was the 18th century Eltz Castle. Due to its strategic and above all cultural and historic importance, Vukovar became a chief target of the Serbian aggression against East Croatia. Although 40,000 civilians found themselves surrounded there, the order was given to raze the town to the ground. All the buildings in the old city centre, the houses, palaces, churches and monasteries, were seriously damaged or completely destroyed. The enemy wanted to put up new symbols to show the dominance of the conqueror. The relics of Saint Boniface, the guardian saint of the town, and the numerous nationalities and ethnic groups residing in it, were kept in St. Philip and Jacob's Church in the Franciscan monastery. First bombarded and then bombed, the church and monastery compound were completely destroyed. The same fate befell the late Baroque Eltz Castle. The rich collection of prehistoric artifacts of the Vučedol culture and the precious Bauer collection of works of art were plundered after the fall of Vukovar and taken to Serbia. The town was besieged for more than 3 months, resisting unrelenting attacks. 600 tanks, 30,000 soldiers, bombers with napalm and cluster bombs were destroying Vukovar day and night. Faced with extinction, the citizens of Vukovar became soldiers, fighting for the freedom of their friends and relatives, of their city, of their homeland. It was on the battlefield of Vukovar that the Serbian forces suffered 1/3 of their total losses in the aggression against Croatia. More than 300 tanks were destroyed by the heroic defenders of the town. The Serbian hatred culminated in a frenzy of destruction as soon as the town fell. There was ruthless killing and looting. More than 2,000 civilians and 1,000 defenders were killed. About 3,000 people are missing since the fall of the town. According to Serbian reports, an average of 110 shells were fired at each house. On November the 19th, 1991, Vukovar ceased to be a living town. It had become a necropolis, the town of the dead. Every town hands down its cultural tradition from generation to generation through its buildings, treasures, archives, monuments and books, and above all, its people. In Roman times, Osijek was an important fortification on the northern border of the Roman Empire. The present town emerged around the fort built in the early 18th century as a defense against the Turks. A few months before waging full-scale war on Croatia, the Yugoslav army began acts of terror. The ensuing events in Osijek, which is the cultural, commercial and administrative center of this part of Croatia, foreshadowed all the brutality of the Serbian aggression that was about to fall on Croatia. In early September, the aggressor began with random attacks on the town. About 100,000 inhabitants were exposed to daily attacks on their lives. Two-thirds of the old city centre was affected by these indiscriminate assaults. The Croatian National Theatre, built in 1866, received a number of hits. During one attack, it caught fire and suffered immeasurable damage. The fort of Osijek, a unique Baroque complex of military, civil and sacral buildings, was battered. The Church of the Holy Cross with the Franciscan monastery suffered serious damage. A shell devastated the interior. The roof structure and all the stained glass windows were destroyed. But this was only the beginning of attacks on this cultural treasure. St. Michael's Church was built by Jesuits in the first half of the 18th century in the style of Baroque classicism. Its facade, belfry and roof structure above the sanctuary received direct hits. The incessant attacks inflicted great damage to the Art Nouveau building of the city hospital and other valuable Art Nouveau and classical palaces of Osijek, as well as the neo-Romanesque evangelical church and a number of other churches in Osijek. The neo-Gothic parish church of St. Peter and Paul, built in 1898, was a constant target of the enemy. It's a symbol of Osijek. The citizens of Osijek call it their cathedral. Not a single part of the building was spared. More than 1,000 shells were fired at the facade, destroying virtually all the stained glass windows, the stone engravings and sculptures, the entrance portal, the belfry, and the roof of the northern nave. Osijek was under attack for months. The enemy forces tried to surround it and take it, to cut it off from the rest of Croatia, and to give it the same fate as that of Vukovar, but Osijek held out. Vinkovci, an important cultural center, with a historic heritage going back 1,000 years. Starting in July 1991, it was exposed to terrible destruction. Tanks, infantry, aircraft and artillery of the Serbian forces took part in daily attacks on the city. Churches, church steeples, palaces were targeted in the attempt to wipe out the Croatian heritage. The Baroque building of the City Museum was seriously damaged. The parish church and parsonage were destroyed. The city library was burnt down. Vinkovci and its 35,000 inhabitants were exposed to Serbian air raids, which didn't even spare the city hospital. 3 cities of East Croatia, Vukovar, Osijek and Vinkovci, each in its own way played a crucial role in stopping the Serbian aggression. Nova Gradiška was founded by Empress Marie-Therese to defend Croatia and other European lands against Turkish invasion. It's a typical example of an 18th century frontier town, with its rectangular arrangement of streets, its central square, and its park bounded by arcaded buildings. The Baroque St. Teresa's Church was built in 1756, and the classic parish church of the Immaculate Conception was built in the early 19th century, when Nova Gradiška grew into a military and trading town with 14,000 inhabitants. The ruthlessness of the Serbian terrorist attacks forced Croatians to face the question of how to preserve their dignity and go on living normally in a situation where death was so close. The smashed windows, once reflecting the cultural heritage of the town, became reflections of war. But the inhabitants of Nova Gradiška stood up to the challenge and patched up their damaged property every day, showing amazing ingenuity. During the war in Croatia, 300 historic places were bombarded. 60 of them were completely destroyed. 600 registered cultural monuments were either damaged or destroyed. Nova Gradiška escaped the fate of being reduced to a necropolis, but it is scarred. Most villages in the surroundings of Nova Gradiška were razed to the ground. Another cultural crime was committed by Serbian terrorists in Vocin. The large single-nave church of the Visitation of the Virgin Mary, a unique example of Bohemian Vladislaus Gothic architecture, had been standing there for centuries, until Serb forces occupied the village and set it on fire and took the rich inventory to Serbia. The church, where pilgrimages to Our Lady of Lourdes began in the 19th century, was turned by the Serbian troops into an ammunition store, and when forced to withdraw, they activated the explosives and destroyed one of the rare traces of Croatia's cultural links with the Bohemian court. In spring 1991, Serbian terrorists began their attacks in the area of Pakrac. This soon escalated into large-scale operations. The battles in the town itself devastated all the important buildings and forced almost its entire population to leave. Pakrac is over 800 years old. For centuries it was ruled by the Knights of the Order of St. John, but at the end of 1991 it suffered tremendous damage. All the historic buildings were seriously damaged, including the Baroque Church of the Annunciation. The same fate befell the Orthodox Holy Trinity Church from the same period. Pakrac's hospital on the fringe of the town was seriously damaged. The Serbian forces attacked the area from the direction of Bosnia, but were eventually repelled. Lipik has been a spa since the times of ancient Rome. It was occupied by Serbian forces. The Baroque Church of St. Francis of Assisi there was completely destroyed during the occupation, and Lipik itself was plundered and burnt. Almost all the buildings were mined, and whole streets were leveled by bulldozers. It was a case of wanton destruction and plunder. In the middle of the 19th century, during Austro-Hungarian rule, a settlement was built with villas, sanatoriums and hotels, forming the historic nucleus of the present town of Lipik, which had a population of 14,000. The complex of spa buildings showed that Lipik was a typical Central European spa, with an attractive, eclectic architecture. Now there are only ruins, and the beauty of this small town, once so picturesque, can now only be seen on old postcards. The main target of terrorist attack in the summer of 1991 were the Croatian villages and small towns along the banks of the rivers Glina, Una and Kupa. The Yugoslav army and Serbian terrorists launched a surprise attack on Petrinja and occupied it. The unprotected population was forced to leave. 18,000 civilians were driven out of their homes. The town itself was not so much damaged in the fighting, but after taking the town, the occupying forces turned on the old city centre and other cultural treasures and inflicted severe damage on them. Even the trees in the park were cut down. The Baroque parish church of St. Lawrence was fired at point blank from a tank and then reduced to rubble by explosives. The Baroque classic town of Hrvatska Kostajnica grew around the Franciscan monastery and St. Anthony's church, and became a town during the time of Napoleon. In the early summer of 1991, Hrvatska Kostajnica came under attack. About 4,000 inhabitants were forced to flee, taking only the barest necessities. After the seizure of the town, the monastery and the church were destroyed. Only the foundations remain. The population of the occupied towns and villages of this area fled to bigger towns, such as Sisak, a town with a population of 45,000. But Sisak also came under attack. The main target there was the oil refinery, which was attacked on many occasions. The refinery was shrouded in smoke and flames for days. A major ecological disaster threatened this part of Europe. It was averted only thanks to the great efforts of the rescue teams. Zagreb, the capital of Croatia, with a population of about 1 million, plus thousands of refugees, lived for months in the expectation of an all-out attack by Serbian forces. Enemy aircraft daily flew over the city, forcing the inhabitants to run to the shelters. There was an attempt on the life of the President of the Republic, with air-to-ground missiles during his stay in the presidential residence of Banski Dvori, a stately Baroque palace built in the 18th and 19th centuries, and located in the middle of the medieval city centre. It was considerably damaged in the attack. In 1579, in order to contain the advancing Turks, Archduke Charles of Habsburg built a fort, which became the nucleus of the old city centre of Karlovac, a town built on 4 rivers. Along with Palma Nova in Italy, it's the best preserved military Renaissance complex in Europe. At the close of the 20th century, this town with 60,000 inhabitants again became an important strategic place in the defense of Croatia against Eastern invaders. The historic monuments and the Baroque city centre came under attack. The Baroque Orthodox Church of St. Nicholas was wrecked in airstrikes. Gospic, an important link between the continental and coastal parts of Croatia, came into being in the 17th century. Like Karlovac, it also had a strategic role. There was fierce fighting in the very centre of the town. The Baroque parish church of Virgin Mary's Annunciation received a number of direct hits and went up in flames. The old city centre was severely damaged. Battles were fought for every house, every street. The town's infrastructure and all its industrial plants were ravaged. With great sacrifice, the defenders managed to stop the Serbian advance. Serbian forces tried to cut off the Croatian territory along the Adriatic coast from the continental part of Croatia by destroying Maslenica Bridge, the most important strategic link between the north and south of Croatia. Pag Bridge also came under attack in the attempt to sever the Adriatic towns from the inland areas and thus divide Croatia into 2 parts. Missiles launched from land, air and sea devastated the cultural treasures of ancient coastal towns such as Zadar, a town with a preserved orthogonal arrangement of the Roman castrum, enriched over succeeding centuries by masterpieces of Romanesque, Gothic, Renaissance and Baroque architecture. The Serbian forces first tried to surround the city and destroy its infrastructure and communications to bring it into complete isolation. Zadar's 76,000 inhabitants were cut off from food, water and power supply lines. The Captain's Tower, the only tower left from the 13th century fortification system, was hit, and so was San Michele's land gate, an example of high Renaissance architecture. St. Anastasia's Cathedral was built in the 12th century, close to the Forum, on the site of an early Christian church. This Romanesque basilica was struck by 2 air missiles. Many palaces in the city suffered damage. The medieval prince's residence, now housing a concert hall and a music school, was hit by a number of missiles. Its roofing, top floor and western wing were destroyed, together with the inventory inside. St. Simon's Church, of exceptional importance for the history of architecture, with its oldest parts dating from early Christianity, was damaged. Zadar, like other Croatian towns, has taken action to protect its historic buildings from attack. Šibenik was first mentioned in 1066, when visited by the Croatian king Petar Krešimir IV. Šibenik's old city centre abounds in stately palaces and sacred buildings. During the sea and land attacks, the palaces and the city theatre were badly damaged. The Serb forces tried to destroy the town's infrastructure, especially the power supply system. The Renaissance Square, with the town hall built in 1542, was also targeted. Šibenik's Gothic Renaissance and Jacob's Cathedral is an outstanding work of Juraj Dalmatinac and a series of Croatian and Italian architects. The cathedral is considered a masterpiece, part of the World Cultural Heritage. The cupola, a feat of Renaissance workmanship, was hit by an armor-piercing bullet fired from a gunboat. Dubrovnik's old city centre is one of the few cities entered in its entirety in UNESCO's Register of World Cultural Heritage. It arose in the 13th century on early Christian foundations. All its precious buildings were built between the 14th and 19th centuries. For months, the city was under attack from land, sea and air. The rich interiors of Renaissance summer houses and palaces, the priceless treasures of numerous churches, monasteries and libraries went up in flames or were destroyed in the rubble of the ancient buildings. The public was dismayed at these attacks on Dubrovnik, especially as there were no military forces in the city or any buildings of strategic importance. Despite being under blockade, the people of Dubrovnik got down to the pressing task of repairing their homes and their city. The Serbian forces had been preparing their onslaught for some years. All over the area of former Yugoslavia, they were building up their military base, ready to attack not only the people, but the European and world cultural heritage. Ethnic cleansing and the destruction of cultural treasures were not a result of war operations. They were the political goal of the Serbian forces in their attempt to expand their territory. To accept this would mean to accept occupation, war crimes and ethnic cleansing as defensible means of solving conflicts. And if this is accepted, then any city could become a necropolis.